The most painful sound in that wood-paneled room wasn't the sharp crack of the gavel, but her cousin Dorian's laughter, low, deliberate, and dripping with contempt, as he slid a single crumpled dollar bill across the mahogany table toward Marguerite Tran like she was a beggar asking for spare change. His family sat in the gallery watching with cold, satisfied smiles. "That's Solomon's final word on what you're worth to this family," Dorian said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. But what Dorian didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that the moment Maggie reached for that dollar, she was reaching for something her great-uncle Solomon had spent an entire lifetime hiding. Something so carefully protected, so brilliantly concealed, that the very people trying to destroy her had unknowingly been its guardians for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The law offices of Hargrove and Sperry occupied the second floor of a red brick colonial building on the edge of Dunmore, New Hampshire, the kind of place that smelled of old wood and older money. Marguerite "Maggie" Tran had driven 2.5 hours from her apartment in Concord to be here, wearing her best wool coat, the navy one she'd bought for her daughter Iris's college graduation 11 years ago. It still fit, though it hung a little differently now, the way everything in Maggie's life hung a little differently since Solomon Whittaker had passed away 6 weeks earlier at the age of 91. Solomon had been the quiet giant of the Whittaker family, a retired craftsman who had spent decades restoring historic properties across New England. He had lived alone in the same modest farmhouse outside Dunmore for as long as anyone could remember. He drove an old pickup truck. He cooked his own meals. He wore the same canvas work jacket from October through March without complaint. Nobody in the family had ever thought much about Solomon's finances because Solomon never talked about money. He talked about craftsmanship, about patience, about the importance of doing things right even when no one was watching. Maggie had adored him. She was the only one who had visited him regularly over the past decade, driving up on weekends, sitting with him on the porch, listening to his stories about the old houses he'd worked on, the families he'd known, the way buildings held memory in their walls, the way people held memory in their bones. When his health began to decline 2 years ago, Maggie had been the one to take him to his doctor's appointments, to stock his refrigerator, to sit beside him on the difficult nights when the pain made sleep impossible. She hadn't done any of it expecting anything in return. She had done it because she loved him and because no one else would. The rest of the Whittaker family, specifically Dorian Fitch, Solomon's grandnephew through his late brother Edmund, and Dorian's aging father Rupert, had barely visited Solomon in years. They lived in Boston, in a large house in Brookline that Rupert had purchased decades ago using money that, according to quiet family whispers, had been partly borrowed and quietly forgotten. They moved in expensive circles. They wore expensive clothes. They carried the particular brand of confidence that comes not from genuine achievement, but from the unshakable belief that the world owed them something simply by virtue of who they believed they were. When Solomon died, Dorian and Rupert arrived in Dunmore within 48 hours. Not to grieve, to assess. Maggie had watched them walk through Solomon's farmhouse with the practiced eyes of men doing inventory, opening closets, peering into the barn, standing in the yard and looking at the surrounding land with expressions that weren't sad but calculating. She had said nothing. She had made coffee, sat at the kitchen table and told herself that whatever Solomon had decided to leave behind was his right to decide, and she would accept it with grace, no matter what it was. She had not expected this. The reading of the will took place in Conrad Sperry's conference room, a long rectangular space lined with bookshelves and lit by tall windows that overlooked Dunmore's quiet town square. Judge Roland Hess was present to oversee the proceedings, a measured man in his mid-60s with reading glasses perched at the end of his nose and the tired patience of someone who had witnessed too many family disputes to be surprised anymore by what grief and greed could do to people. Dorian and Rupert sat on one side of the conference table, flanked by their attorney and by Celeste, Dorian's wife, who had dressed for the occasion in a cream cashmere sweater and delicate pearl earrings that caught the pale winter light filtering through the windows. She looked, Maggie thought, like a woman who had already decided where she would put the furniture. Maggie sat alone on the other side. Conrad Sperry cleared his throat and began to read "The Farmhouse and its Surrounding 14 Acres of Land" to Dorian Fitch. Solomon's remaining financial accounts to Rupert Fitch to be distributed at his discretion, personal property, furniture, tools and equipment to Dorian Fitch. And to Marguerite Tran, the document read in Solomon's own carefully chosen words, "I leave the sum of $1 as a token of my affection." The room went completely silent. Then Dorian laughed. It wasn't a surprised laugh or an uncomfortable one. It was the laugh of a man who had been anticipating this moment and was savoring every single second of it. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a $1 bill, worn and soft from handling, its edges faintly frayed, and slid it deliberately across the table toward Maggie with 2 fingers, the way someone might slide a tip to a server they wanted to humiliate. "There you go," he said. Solomon's final word on the matter. Celeste pressed her lips together, suppressing a smile that didn't quite stay suppressed. Rupert leaned back in his chair with the settled expression of a man whose expectations had been confirmed entirely. Behind them, a small cluster of Whittaker cousins who had come to witness the proceedings exchanged sidelong glances that mixed barely concealed shock with something that looked dangerously close to delight. Maggie looked at the dollar bill resting on the table in front of her. She looked at Dorian. She looked down at her hands, which were folded neatly in her lap and which were not shaking because she had made herself a promise that morning in the parking lot that they would not shake. She reached for the bill. And that was the moment the door to the conference room opened. The man who stepped through the door was not young. He moved carefully, the way people move when their joints have begun to register the weight of years, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that filled the room the moment he entered it. He was perhaps 75, slight and neat in a charcoal gray suit that was old but impeccably maintained, his white hair combed back from a face that was deeply lined and utterly composed. He carried a worn leather briefcase in one hand and a manila folder in the other, and he looked around the conference room with the calm, unhurried gaze of a man who had walked into difficult rooms before and was not afraid of them. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, addressing Judge Hess directly. "My name is Eugene Alcott. I'm an attorney, and I represent certain interests connected to the estate of Solomon Whittaker. I have documentation that I believe is directly relevant to these proceedings." Conrad Sperry was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Alcott is not listed as counsel in any filing connected to this estate. I've never heard his name in connection with Solomon Whittaker. We're in the middle of a properly filed probate reading and this interruption is noted," Judge Hess said, raising one hand to quiet him. He looked at Eugene Alcott with steady, appraising eyes. "Mr. Alcott, I'd like to see your credentials and your documentation before we go any further. And I'd like to understand why you're appearing at this particular moment rather than having filed in advance." "Because," Eugene said, setting his briefcase down carefully on the end of the conference table, "I was instructed by my client not to appear until after the will had been read in full. Those were Solomon Whittaker's explicit instructions, and I followed them." He opened the manila folder and placed a single document on the table in front of the judge. "I've been Solomon's attorney for private matters for 31 years. This is my documentation. And what I've brought today will require a brief recess before these proceedings continue." The room shifted. Dorian's expression, which had been settled comfortably into triumph, flickered, just slightly, just enough for Maggie to notice, but she said nothing. She sat very still, her hands now resting on top of the dollar bill Dorian had slid across the table, and she waited. She had spent a great deal of her life waiting. She was good at it. Marguerite Tran was 67 years old, and she had come from the kind of life that builds quiet strength in people the way pressure builds diamonds, slowly, invisibly, and at considerable cost. She had been born in Lowell, Massachusetts, the only child of Vietnamese immigrants who had arrived in the United States in 1979 with 4 suitcases, a handful of addresses written on a piece of paper, and a determination so fierce it had never fully left their daughter, even now, all these decades later. Her father, Hien, had worked in a textile mill for 20 years. Her mother, Lan, had cleaned houses and later taken in alterations from a small table set up in the corner of their kitchen. They had worked without complaint, without drama, and without the expectation that anyone was going to notice. Maggie had grown up watching them and learning, without being explicitly taught, that dignity was not something other people gave you. It was something you maintained yourself, quietly, every single day, regardless of what the world decided to hand you. She had studied accounting at UMass Lowell on a scholarship she'd applied for without telling anyone, because in her household you didn't announce things until they were certain. She had graduated, worked for 15 years at a mid-sized firm in Manchester, and then left to raise her 2 children, Iris and Felix, when her husband Daniel's job required relocation and the cost of childcare made 2 careers briefly impractical. When Daniel passed away from a sudden cardiac event 11 years ago, Iris was 22 and Felix was 19, and Maggie was 56 years old and suddenly completely alone in a way she had not anticipated and did not know how to name. She had gone back to work. A smaller firm this time, part-time bookkeeping for local businesses in Concord, enough to cover her modest apartment and her modest expenses. She had not complained, she had not asked her children for money, though both had offered. She had simply continued, the way her parents had continued, with her spine straight and her expectations quiet and her hands always busy with something useful. Solomon Whittaker had come into her life through her mother, who had cleaned his farmhouse for 3 summers in the late 1980s when Maggie was still in college. Solomon had always been kind to Lan Tran in the specific way that genuinely decent people are kind, not performatively, not condescendingly, but simply and consistently, as though it had never occurred to him to behave any other way. When Lan passed away from cancer 14 years ago, Solomon had driven 4 hours to attend her funeral. He had stood at the back of the room in his canvas work jacket and held his hat in his hands and said nothing to anyone, and Maggie had loved him for it in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to forget. After that, she had made a point of staying in touch, a phone call every few weeks, a visit when she could manage it, as his circle of people slowly narrowed the way circles do when someone reaches their late 80s, old friends passing, family drifting. Maggie had found herself becoming more present in his life almost without planning it. She took him to his appointments. She stocked his kitchen. She sat with him on the porch and listened to his stories, and she asked questions because she was genuinely curious about the man he had been before she knew him, about the houses he had restored, about the families behind the walls he had repaired. He had never once suggested that she would receive anything from his estate. She had never once thought about it. The visits were their own reward, simple and complete, which made sitting in this conference room across a mahogany table from Dorian Fitch and his dollar bill and his cold, satisfied smile feel like a particular cruelty, not because of the money, though the money was real and her apartment was small and her savings were thin, but because it suggested that Solomon, her Solomon, the man who had driven 4 hours in a canvas jacket to stand at the back of a funeral, had seen her the way Dorian saw her, as someone worth exactly $1. She couldn't make herself believe it. That was why, when Eugene Alcott had walked through that door and the room had shifted and Dorian's expression had flickered, Maggie had not moved, had not gasped, had simply sat with her hands resting on that worn dollar bill and waited, the way her mother had always waited for things that mattered, with patience and with faith, and without making a sound. Judge Hess granted the recess. He gave Eugene Alcott 15 minutes, which was enough time for Conrad Sperry to straighten his tie 3 times and for Dorian Fitch to pull his attorney into the corner of the hallway outside the conference room and conduct a rapid, whispered conversation that involved a great deal of gesturing and at least one moment where Dorian's voice rose sharply enough to be audible through the closed door before he caught himself and lowered it again. Maggie remained at the conference table. She didn't go to the hallway. She didn't check her phone. She sat in the same chair she'd occupied since the beginning, with the dollar bill still beneath her hands, and she looked out the tall windows at Dunmore's town square below. A light snow had begun to fall, fine and unhurried, dusting the tops of the parked cars and the bare branches of the elms that lined the square. It was the kind of snow that didn't commit to anything. It simply fell because it was winter, and that was what winter did. Celeste Fitch had not left the room either. She sat at the far end of the table, scrolling through something on her phone with the practiced disengagement of someone who wanted to appear unbothered. But every few moments her eyes lifted and moved to Maggie with the quick, assessing quality of a woman trying to read a situation she hadn't anticipated needing to read. Maggie did not look back at her. Before Eugene Alcott had appeared in that doorway, the morning had unfolded with the specific, grinding cruelty of something that had been carefully planned. Dorian and Rupert had arrived at Hargrove and Sperry's offices 20 minutes early, which Maggie understood was intentional. When she walked in at 5 minutes before the appointed hour, having driven through light traffic, having found parking on the first try, having given herself what she thought was adequate time, they were already seated, already arranged, already occupying the room in a way that made her feel she had walked into their space rather than a neutral one. Rupert Fitch was 74 years old and had the look of a man who had once been physically imposing and had spent the intervening decades trading muscle for authority. He was broad through the shoulders, white-haired, with the kind of permanent frown that on some men reads as seriousness and on others reads as grievance. On Rupert it read as both. He had shaken Maggie's hand when she entered, once, firmly, without warmth, and then turned back to his conversation with Conrad Sperry, as though the greeting had been a box to check rather than a human interaction. Dorian was 51, taller than his father and thinner, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He wore a charcoal suit with a pocket square. His shoes were the kind that made a particular sound on hardwood floors, the sound of deliberate quality. He had not shaken Maggie's hand. He had looked at her when she entered, nodded once with the minimal acknowledgement one gives to someone whose presence is an administrative necessity rather than a welcome, and returned to his phone. Celeste had smiled. The smile was technically warm and actually not, the kind of expression that had been practiced in mirrors until it looked natural from a distance but fell apart up close, where the eyes didn't quite match the mouth. The three Whittaker cousins who had arrived to witness the proceedings, distant relatives Maggie barely knew, a woman named Sylvia and two brothers whose names she could never remember, had taken seats in the chairs along the wall and arranged themselves into the quiet, anticipatory stillness of people who had come to watch something interesting happen. When Conrad Sperry began reading the will, Maggie had listened with her hands folded and her face composed. She had told herself, in the parking lot that morning, in the elevator on the way up, in the 30 seconds she had stood outside the conference room door gathering herself, that she would not react. Whatever Solomon had decided, she would accept it. She had not come here for money. She had come because Solomon had asked his attorney to notify her of the reading, and she had assumed that meant he wanted her present, and she had honored that because honoring things was what she did. When Sperry reached her name in the document and read Solomon's words, "I leave the sum of $1 as a token of my affection," she had felt something move through her that she could not entirely name. It wasn't surprise, or, not only surprise, it was something older and more complicated. The particular grief of discovering that you had misunderstood something you thought you understood completely. She had looked at the table, she had breathed, and then Dorian had laughed and produced the dollar bill and slid it across the mahogany surface with those two fingers and said what he said, and the cousins along the wall had exchanged their glances, and Celeste had pressed her lips together over that smile that didn't quite stay contained, and Rupert had leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a verdict confirmed. 40 years of visiting a lonely old man, and that's your return on investment, Dorian said, turning to Celeste as though Maggie were no longer worth addressing directly. Should have spent her weekends differently. Celeste laughed, a soft, private sound that was somehow worse than a loud one. "Mr. Fitch," Judge Hess said, in a tone that made it clear he found none of this acceptable, and also that he currently lacked the legal mechanism to say so more forcefully. Dorian looked at him with the mild, unapologetic expression of a man who had never once in his life been held meaningfully accountable for anything. "Just making an observation, Your Honor," he said pleasantly. Maggie had reached for the dollar bill, and that was when the door had opened. The 15 minutes passed. Judge Hess reconvened the room with a single knock of his gavel on the conference table, and everyone returned to their seats with the shuffling, reluctant energy of people who had been pulled away from conversations they weren't finished with. Dorian buttoned his jacket as he sat down. Conrad Sperry arranged his papers. Rupert settled into his chair with the heaviness of a man conserving effort. Celeste folded her hands on the table and directed her attention toward the front of the room with the composed, attentive expression of someone sitting in church. Eugene Alcott stood at the end of the table, his worn leather briefcase open in front of him, his manila folder replaced now by a larger accordion file bound with a faded red cord. He looked, if anything, calmer than he had when he'd first walked in, the way certain people become calmer as situations become more serious, as though gravity steadies them rather than unsettles them. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured and clear. "Before I present the documentation I've brought today, I'd like to request something from Miss Tran." He looked at Maggie directly. "Miss Tran, do you still have the dollar bill that was presented to you earlier in these proceedings?" Every head in the room turned toward Maggie. She looked down at her hands, which were still resting flat on the table, still covering the worn bill beneath them. "Yes," she said. "Would you be willing to hand it to me briefly? I'd like to examine it before we proceed." Conrad Spiri was already objecting. "Your Honor, that dollar bill was presented as part of a documented bequest. It's a probate asset. Mr. Alcott has no standing to—" "Mr. Sperry," Judge Hess interrupted, removing his reading glasses and setting them on the table with the deliberate patience of a man choosing his battles. "Mr. Alcott has presented valid credentials and documentation establishing his 31-year relationship as private counsel to the deceased. I'm going to allow him to examine the bill. You'll have every opportunity to object to whatever follows." He nodded at Maggie. "Miss Tran." Maggie picked up the dollar bill and held it out to Eugene Alcott. He took it with both hands, which she noticed were very steady for a man of his age, and held it up toward the window where the pale winter light fell across it cleanly. He examined it for a long moment, turning it slowly, his eyes moving across the surface with the focused attention of someone reading something small and important. Then he lowered it and looked at Maggie with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward, something between relief and sorrow, and a deep, complicated pride. "Thank you," he said quietly. He set the bill carefully on the table in front of him. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a short recess, 10 minutes. I need to speak with Miss Tran privately before we continue." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The small room Eugene led her to was a narrow side office off the main hallway, furnished with a single desk, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the building's rear parking lot. He closed the door carefully behind them and set his briefcase on the desk and stood for a moment in the particular silence of someone organizing thoughts that have waited a long time to be spoken. "How well did you know Solomon?" he asked. "Well," Maggie said, "I thought I knew him well." Eugene nodded slowly. "You did, better than anyone. He told me that many times." He opened his briefcase and removed a single envelope, old and cream-colored, sealed with wax that had been pressed with a small circular stamp. He held it but did not yet hand it to her. "Solomon came to me 31 years ago with a private matter. He was very specific about what he wanted, and very specific about when he wanted it handled. He told me to wait until after his estate had been formally read. He told me that the reading would tell me what I needed to know about whether the time was right." "What do you mean, what you needed to know?" Eugene looked at her steadily. "He told me that if Dorian presented you with that dollar bill the way he expected Dorian would, it meant certain things had happened exactly as Solomon had anticipated. It meant you had been humiliated. It meant the people who believed themselves to be his heirs had shown their character completely and irrevocably." He paused, "and it meant you were ready." Maggie felt something shift beneath her ribs. Ready for what? Eugene set the envelope on the desk between them. "Solomon Whitaker did not die a poor man, Maggie. He died a very specific kind of wealthy man. The kind who understood that visible wealth is vulnerable wealth. The kind who spent decades ensuring that what he built could not be touched, could not be claimed, and could not be found by people who would misuse it." He opened his accordion file and began laying documents on the desk in careful, ordered rows. "For the past 31 years I have been managing a set of trusts, property holdings, and legal instruments that Solomon established in absolute secrecy. No family member knew of their existence. No other attorney was involved. Everything was structured to transfer to a single beneficiary upon his death, but only after the formal probate reading had concluded." Maggie looked at the documents spreading across the desk. She looked at Eugene. "Why after the reading?" "Because Solomon knew his family," Eugene said simply. "He knew that if Dorian and Rupert discovered the existence of these assets before the reading, they would find a way to contest them, to complicate them, to insert themselves legally before the transfer could be completed. By filing a separate will for these specific holdings with a different probate court in a different county 30 years ago, and by ensuring that nothing was triggered until after today's reading became official record, he closed every door they might have tried to walk through." Eugene looked at her with quiet certainty. "As of this morning, when Judge Hess formally accepted the reading of the primary will into the record, the transfer mechanism Solomon established was automatically initiated. It cannot be challenged. It cannot be reversed, and it is entirely, completely, and legally yours." Maggie's hands were very still in her lap. "What is it?" she asked. "What did he leave?" Eugene reached into the accordion file one final time and produced a single key. It was old and heavy, ornate in the way of keys made before keys became purely functional, its bow shaped into a small circular flourish. It had been kept with obvious care, No rust, no tarnish, the metal bright and solid. He placed it on the desk in front of her. "He left you the estate," Eugene said. "All of it. The real one. The one no one knew existed." He placed his hand briefly, gently, on the stack of documents between them. "And there is a letter. He was very insistent that you read it before we return to that conference room. He wanted you to understand everything before you faced them again." Maggie picked up the key. It was heavier than she expected, warm from being held inside Eugene's briefcase, and it sat in her palm with the solid, certain weight of something that had been waiting a very long time to be found. "Show me the letter," she said. The letter was written in Solomon's hand, which Maggie recognized immediately, the careful, deliberate print of a man who had spent decades marking measurements on wood and stone, each letter formed with the same precision he brought to everything he built. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the same stock as the envelope, and it had been folded into thirds with the neat, unhurried care of someone who had written it knowing it would matter. She read it aloud, quietly, with Eugene sitting across from her in silence. "My dear Maggie, if you are reading this, then something I hoped would remain a private joke between myself and the universe has instead become necessary. I am sorry for that. I am sorry that Dorian behaved exactly as I expected him to, and that you had to sit in that room and endure it. You deserved better. You have always deserved better. But I need you to understand something before you go back in there. What happened this morning was not a verdict on your worth. It was a verdict on theirs. And there is a difference that matters enormously. When I was 34 years old, I restored a farmhouse in Grafton County that had belonged to a family named Aldridge. They had more money than sense, as my mother used to say, and they treated the people who worked on their property the way certain people treat furniture, useful until replaced, and not worth thinking about in between. I spent 8 months on that house. I rebuilt the foundation. I restructured the roofline. I repaired things that 3 previous contractors had told them were beyond saving. When I finished, the father of the family handed me my check without looking up from his newspaper and told his son, standing nearby, that good help was getting harder to find every year. He did not know my name. He had never asked it. I drove home that evening and I made a decision. I decided that I was going to spend the rest of my working life solving problems that other people couldn't see, and I was going to do it quietly, and I was going to document everything, and no one was ever going to be able to take credit for what I built. I began acquiring property, not the kind of property that announces itself, not grand houses or commercial buildings or anything that would draw attention or require a name on a deed that someone might connect to the man fixing their windows. I acquired land, quietly, carefully, over 30 years, through a series of holding companies and trusts that Eugene helped me establish. Parcels of land in 4 counties across New Hampshire and Vermont, most of them unremarkable at the time of purchase, most of them in areas that no one was paying attention to yet. I paid cash. I used entities with names that meant nothing to anyone. I kept no records at my home, nothing that Dorian or Rupert might stumble across during one of their rare visits. Eugene kept everything, and Eugene kept faith, and I am grateful to him in ways I never fully expressed while I was alive. The estate I am leaving you consists of 11 parcels of land totaling approximately 340 acres across 4 counties. 3 of those parcels sit in corridors that 2 separate development companies have been attempting to acquire for the past 6 years. Eugene has documentation of their interest and their offers, which he was instructed to decline until after my death. There is also the farmhouse itself. Not the one you visited me in, which I have left to Dorian because I wanted him to have something to feel satisfied about before the rest of this became clear. The farmhouse I am leaving you is a property I restored 40 years ago in Sutton, New Hampshire, a 12-room federal-style house on 60 acres that I purchased from the Aldridge family when they fell into debt and needed a quiet buyer. I paid them a fair price. I asked for nothing. I simply wanted the house, and I wanted them to know, without ever being told, that the man who fixed what couldn't be fixed was the same man who ended up with what they couldn't keep. I never told anyone I owned it. I have been maintaining it through a property management arrangement that Eugene oversees. It is in excellent condition. It has been waiting for you. The current assessed value of all holdings combined, as of the most recent independent appraisal Eugene commissioned 18 months ago, is approximately $6.4 million. With the pending development interest in 3 of the parcels, Eugene believes the realistic current market value is considerably higher. My dear Maggie, you visited me for years without asking for anything. You sat on my porch and listened to an old man talk about walls and wood and the way buildings hold memory. You drove through snowstorms to take me to appointments. You stocked my kitchen and held my hand on difficult nights, and never once made me feel like a burden. You are not worth $1. You were never worth $1. You are worth everything I spent a lifetime building, because you are the only person I ever met who would have loved me just the same if I had nothing at all. Use this wisely, use it generously, and know that every acre of it was earned by someone who understood, as I believe you do, that the most valuable things are almost always the ones nobody bothered to notice. With all my love, always, Solomon. Maggie set the letter down on the desk. She sat for a long moment in the narrow office with the winter light coming through the window behind her and Eugene Alcott sitting quietly across from her, giving her the time that the moment required. Outside in the hallway she could hear the muffled sound of Dorian's voice, impatient, asking someone how much longer this was going to take. She looked at Eugene. "The dollar bill," she said. "Was it deliberate? Did Solomon know they would use it?" Eugene allowed himself a small, precise smile. "Solomon knew Dorian," he said. "He told me, the last time I visited him, that Dorian would find a way to make the dollar theatrical. He said that was simply who Dorian was. And he said that if Dorian handed you that dollar in front of witnesses, it would be the last significant thing Dorian Fitch ever took from you." Maggie picked up the key from the desk where it had been resting beside the letter. She turned it once in her hand, feeling its weight, its certainty, its patience. "Then we should go back in," she said. "I have an estate to accept." They walked back into the conference room together. Dorian was already speaking when the door opened, mid-sentence in a conversation with Conrad Sperry that stopped abruptly when he saw Maggie's face. Whatever he had expected to see there, the reddened eyes of a woman who had been crying, the tightened jaw of someone preparing to accept defeat gracefully, the general posture of a person who had been taken into a side room and given bad news, he did not see it. What he saw instead was something he couldn't immediately categorize, and that gap in his understanding made him go very still for just a moment before he rearranged himself back into confidence. "Finally," he said, settling into his chair, "are we done with the interruption?" Eugene Alcott set his accordion file on the table and untied the faded red cord with the calm, methodical movements of a man who had all the time in the world. "Not quite," he said pleasantly. Judge Hess called the room to order and looked at Eugene over his reading glasses. "Mr. Alcott, you requested this recess to speak with Miss Tran. Are you prepared to explain to the room what you've brought today and why it's relevant to these proceedings?" "I am, Your Honor." Eugene opened the accordion file and began distributing documents down the length of the table with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been waiting 31 years for this specific moment and was not going to rush it now that it had arrived. "What I'm providing to the court today is documentation of a secondary estate established by Solomon Whitaker through a separate probate filing made 30 years ago in Merrimack County. This filing was legally valid at the time of its creation, has been maintained in good standing throughout the intervening decades, and was structured to activate automatically upon the formal acceptance of the primary will into the official probate record, which occurred approximately 40 minutes ago." Conrad Sperry picked up the documents in front of him and began reading with the rapid, focused intensity of a man looking for errors. His expression, which began with the confident expectation of finding them, shifted slowly as he read, the way weather shifts, gradually then all at once. "Your Honor," he said, and stopped. He started again. "Your Honor, I need a moment to review." "Take your time," Eugene said. Dorian leaned across to look at Sperry's documents. Sperry tilted them slightly away, which was itself a telling gesture, and Dorian's expression tightened. "Conrad, what is this?" Sperry didn't answer immediately. He turned to the third page, then the fifth, then went back to the first. His jaw had developed a faint, involuntary tension that he was visibly working to control. "Mr. Alcott," Judge Hess said, looking over his own copy of the documents, "walk me through the structure of this secondary estate." Eugene did so with clarity and precision. He explained the holding companies. He explained the land parcels, 11 of them, 340 acres across 4 counties, acquired quietly over 3 decades. He explained the federal-style farmhouse in Sutton, 12 rooms on 60 acres, maintained in excellent condition through a property management arrangement that had been active for 40 years. He explained the development interest in 3 of the parcels and the offers that had been declined pending Solomon's death. He explained the independent appraisal conducted 18 months ago and the figure it had produced. When he said the number, $6.4 million assessed, with realistic market value considerably higher given pending development interest, the room went so completely silent that Maggie could hear the snow falling outside the window. Then Dorian said, with the specific vocal quality of a man whose certainty has just developed a crack directly through its center, "That's not possible." "I assure you it is," Eugene said. "I have 31 years of documentation supporting every element of what I've presented. The legal structure is sound. The transfer mechanism activated this morning as designed, and the sole beneficiary, named in the Merrimack County filing, is Marguerite Tran." Dorian turned to look at Maggie. She met his gaze steadily, the way she had been meeting difficult things steadily for 67 years, and she said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. "He can't have," Dorian started. "He was a handyman. He restored old houses. He drove a pickup truck and lived in that farmhouse for 40 years. There is no way Solomon Whitaker was sitting on $6 million. 6.4, Eugene said gently. "Assessed. The market figure is likely closer to 8. Rupert Fitch, who had not spoken since the recess began, made a sound that was not quite a word. He had gone a particular shade that Maggie associated with men whose blood pressure was staging a quiet protest. Celeste was very still at the end of the table, her folded hands now gripping each other with a pressure that had turned her knuckles faintly white. Judge Hess removed his glasses and set them on the table. He looked at Maggie with the kind of expression that tired, experienced people produce when the world briefly restores their faith in something. "Miss Tran," he said, "do you have any questions about the documentation Mr. Alcott has presented?" Maggie looked at the key in her hand. She looked at the stack of documents Eugene had laid across the table. She looked, briefly, at Dorian Fitch, who was staring at the tabletop with the hollow, uncomprehending expression of a man watching a certainty he had built his entire morning on dissolve in real time. "No questions," she said. "I'd like to accept the estate." She signed where Eugene indicated. Her hand was not shaking. When the proceedings concluded 20 minutes later and the room began to empty with the particular awkward haste of people who want to be elsewhere, Dorian paused at the door. He turned back to look at Maggie, and for just a moment his expression lost its architecture entirely. The confidence, the contempt, the practiced ease all falling briefly away to reveal something underneath that looked almost like a man trying to understand how he had arrived at this specific moment in his life. "He never said a word," Dorian said. "It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was simply the sound of a man revising a story he had believed completely." "No," Maggie agreed, "he never did." Dorian left. The door closed behind him, and Maggie sat alone in the conference room with Eugene Alcott and the winter light and the key to a hidden estate resting solid and warm in her palm, and she allowed herself, quietly and privately, to cry. The farmhouse in Sutton was everything Solomon's letter had promised. Maggie drove there alone on a Thursday morning in early February, 3 weeks after the proceedings in Dunmore, following Eugene's directions down a series of roads that narrowed progressively until the last half-mile was a gravel lane cutting through a stand of old maples, their bare branches arching overhead in the pale winter light like the vaulted ceiling of something ancient and deliberate. She parked where the lane ended and sat in her car for a long moment before getting out. The house stood on a gentle rise, 12 rooms of federal-style brick and timber that had been built in 1847 and restored, Eugene had told her, to a condition that surpassed its original construction. Solomon had spent 4 years on it in the 1980s before purchasing it from the Aldridge family. He had spent the 4 decades since maintaining it through the quiet, invisible care of a man who understood that the best preservation is the kind nobody notices because nothing is ever allowed to deteriorate enough to require dramatic intervention. It was the most beautiful thing Maggie had ever stood in front of. She used the key. The lock turned with the smooth, oiled certainty of a mechanism that had been maintained with the same patience as everything else Solomon had ever touched. The door opened onto a wide central hallway with original wide plank floors, a staircase rising to the second floor in a graceful curve, and windows at the far end that framed a view across 60 acres of snow-covered fields and distant tree lines that made the world look impossibly large and quiet and good. Maggie stood in that hallway for a long time. Then she called her daughter. "Iris," she said, when her daughter answered. "I need you and Felix to come and see something. Can you both come this weekend?" "Mom, is everything all right?" "Everything," Maggie said, looking through those windows at those fields, at that sky, "is more than all right. I have a story to tell you about Solomon, about the man everyone thought was just a craftsman who fixed old houses. I need you to hear it here, in the house he left us." They came on Saturday, both of them, Felix driving up from Providence and Iris taking the train from Boston. Maggie met them at the end of the gravel lane and watched their faces as the house came into view through the maples. The same involuntary stillness, the same slow intake of breath that she had experienced herself 3 days earlier. She told them everything in the kitchen, sitting around a pine table that Solomon had built himself from timber salvaged during one of his early restorations. She showed them the letter. She showed them Eugene's documentation. She watched their faces move through the same sequence hers had: confusion, then comprehension, then something that went beyond either of those things into a territory that didn't have a clean name but felt like reverence. "He did all of this," Felix said quietly, looking at the documents spread across the table, "and never told anyone." "He told Eugene," Maggie said, "and he told me in a way every time he talked about his work, about solving problems quietly, about building things that lasted, about doing things right even when no one was watching." She folded her hands on the table. "I just didn't know he was also talking about this." Iris looked at the letter again, at the line about the Aldridge family, about the father who hadn't known Solomon's name, about Solomon driving home and making a decision. "He bought their house," she said softly, "the family that treated him like furniture. He bought their house from them when they needed a quiet buyer, and he paid them fairly, and he never told them who he was. He understood something about dignity," Maggie said, "that it doesn't require an audience, that you don't need the people who underestimated you to know they were wrong. You just need to know it yourself." The news moved through Dunmore and beyond with the particular velocity of stories that feel both impossible and inevitable. Maggie had not sought attention, but the probate records were public, and Eugene had made no effort to obscure what had occurred. Within a month, local reporters had pieced together enough to understand the broad shape of the story: the dollar bill, the secret estate, the 31-year arrangement between a quiet craftsman and his patient attorney, and the coverage that followed was modest but genuine. What surprised Maggie was the letters. They arrived at Eugene's office, forwarded to her from people across New England who had known Solomon in various capacities over the decades: homeowners whose properties he had restored, former colleagues who had worked alongside him on historic preservation projects, a woman in Concord who had been his neighbor for 20 years and written to say that she had always thought he was the finest man on their street, and now she understood why without being able to have said why before. Each letter was a fragment of a portrait she hadn't known existed. Solomon the craftsman, yes, but also Solomon the neighbor who plowed driveways without being asked. Solomon the quiet donor who had funded a historical preservation grant at the state level under a company name that no one had connected to him until now. Solomon who had, it emerged, quietly paid the tuition balance for 3 young people from working-class families in Grafton County who had been accepted to engineering programs and couldn't cover the final gap. He had done it all without his name attached to any of it. Maggie read every letter twice. Then she called Eugene. "I want to establish a foundation," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the farmhouse. I want to use a portion of what Solomon left to do what he did, quietly, specifically for people who are creating things and building things and being overlooked while they do it." She paused. "I want to call it the Whitaker Legacy Foundation, and I want its first program to provide free legal support for craftsmen, builders, and working-class inventors who have created something worth protecting but don't have access to the attorneys who can protect it." Eugene was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. When he spoke, his voice had the particular texture of a man who is moved and is not going to pretend otherwise. "Solomon told me once," he said carefully, "that the greatest inheritance isn't money, it's the continuation of intention." He paused. "I think you've just defined his." The Whitaker Legacy Foundation was incorporated in the spring. Maggie moved into the farmhouse in Sutton in April, when the maples along the lane began to bud and the 60 acres of fields showed their first green beneath the retreating snow. She brought almost nothing from her Concord apartment because the farmhouse was already furnished: Solomon's pine table, his bookshelves, his reading chair by the window that looked out across the fields. And because starting over, she had decided, was not about accumulation. It was about arriving finally in the place you were always supposed to be. Solomon's grave was in a small cemetery on the edge of Dunmore, set back from the road behind a low stone wall that he had repaired himself sometime in the 1990s at the request of the groundskeeper, who had mentioned offhandedly that the mortar was failing. Solomon had done it on a Tuesday afternoon without being asked twice and without sending a bill. Maggie came on a morning in late October when the maples along the cemetery's perimeter had gone entirely gold and the air carried the particular clean sharpness of a New England autumn settling into its full intention. She brought flowers from the farmhouse garden, the garden Solomon had planted, and she had continued, learning its logic slowly over the spring and summer, understanding which beds he had prioritized and why. She sat on the low bench beside the headstone and was quiet for a while, the way she had learned to be quiet in Solomon's presence when he was alive, comfortable with the particular texture of silence that exists between people who don't need to fill space to feel connected. "The foundation helped 14 families this year," she said finally, her voice easy and conversational, the way it had always been with him. 14 people who built something worth protecting and didn't know how to protect it. We filed 6 patents. We negotiated 3 licensing agreements that actually pay the inventors fairly. 2 of them called me personally to say they didn't know any of this was possible, that they had assumed what they created just belonged to whoever had the lawyers. She placed the flowers against the base of the headstone. "You knew that feeling," she said. "The Aldridge family. 40 years of being invisible while your work made things better for people who didn't know your name. I think about that often. I think about the decision you made driving home that evening and how quietly enormous it was." A breeze moved through the maples overhead, loosening a drift of gold leaves that fell around her in slow, unhurried spirals. Maggie watched them settle and thought about patience, about the specific kind of love that expresses itself not in grand gestures but in decades of careful, invisible preparation, about what it meant to be known completely by someone who had arranged the entire architecture of their life around making sure you would be safe. There was news she had saved to tell him here, in this place, where it felt right to say things out loud even knowing the silence that answered. 3 months earlier, a letter had arrived from the New Hampshire Preservation Trust, informing the Whitaker Legacy Foundation that Solomon's restoration work on 11 historic properties across the state was being formally recognized as a body of work of significant cultural and architectural importance. His techniques, the letter explained, had been documented by preservation specialists who had examined his projects and found approaches to structural repair and material conservation that were not only exceptional, but in several cases had become the basis for current best practice guidelines in historic preservation across the region. They wanted to name a fellowship after him, the Solomon Whitaker Fellowship in Historic Preservation, awarded annually to a craftsman or builder whose work demonstrated exceptional commitment to the integrity of historic structures. Maggie had cried when she read the letter, alone in the farmhouse kitchen at the pine table he had built, and she was not embarrassed about that. "They figured out what you did," she said now, her hand resting on the cool surface of the headstone. "The preservation people. They examined your work and they understood it. They're going to name a fellowship after you. Young craftsmen are going to receive support in your name. The Invisible Man is going to have his name on something that lasts, and I think you would have had complicated feelings about that, but I also think some part of you would have been quietly, privately glad." She was quiet for a moment. Around her the cemetery held its particular stillness, and the gold light of the October morning fell across everything with the generosity of a season that knows it is ending and gives everything it has left. "Dorian listed the farmhouse for sale last month," she said. "The one you left him. He's having difficulties, from what Eugene tells me. I don't take satisfaction in it, but I don't carry grief for it either. People's choices follow them. You understood that better than anyone." She stood and brushed leaves from her coat and looked at the headstone one final time. The stone was simple, the way Solomon had been simple. His name, his dates, and below them, at Maggie's request, a single line she had chosen from his letter. "The most valuable things are almost always the ones nobody bothered to notice. Thank you," she said, "for the farmhouse and the land and the foundation and the fellowship and all the careful invisible decades of it, but mostly thank you for knowing, before I knew it myself, that I was worth the trouble of protecting." She touched the stone briefly with her fingertips. "I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure other people know that too." She walked back to her car through the falling leaves, And she drove home to the farmhouse on the gravel lane through the arching maples, and she had work to do, and she did it. They thought the dollar was the end of her story, but Solomon had known, 40 years before it happened, that it was only the beginning. Sometimes the people who hand you nothing are the ones who hand you everything. And sometimes the quietest love is the one that builds you a fortress before you even know you need one. Dreams don't age, worth doesn't fade, and the truth always finds its way into the light. Leave a comment below. What would you do if you discovered a hidden legacy left just for you? Because Maggie's story proves that the most powerful gifts are the ones wrapped in patience and love, and the absolute certainty that you are always worth protecting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.